Hello and welcome back into another edition of the Sun Devil Source podcast presented by Jones Auto Centers. As always, I'm your host, Jacob Brooks, and alongside me is our Sun Devil Source publisher, Chris Cartman. It's part 2 of our ASU Fall Camp Preview Series. Chris, we're cranking these out. How are you doing?
Doing well, man. This is awesome. I think people were kind of happy with the first one that we did, which covered the quarterbacks, running backs, and wide receivers. And I'm looking forward to being able to do more of a deep dive on some of these other positions today.
Yeah, so let's just explain it once again. If you missed yesterday's episode about the quarterbacks, running backs, and wide receivers, be sure to go check that out. Today, we're going to be talking about ASU's O-line, D-line, and tight ends. In part 3, we're going to be talking about linebackers and the secondary. And then part 4 is going to be a members-only podcast, so make sure to tap in with the Sanctuary if you haven't already, where we're going to be talking about the biggest storylines and kind of niche things to be looking out for as camp begins. Just a reminder, camp begins on August 5th. That's next week on Wednesday. Chris and I will be there with coverage from that. So let's just get straight into it. Let's start off with the tight ends, Chris. There's a lot to talk about in the tight end room. ASU lost Shimon Mateer and Cameron Harpel, which means that a guy like Kamari Anderson is going to have to step up into a bigger role. He's now on the Pat Tillman Leadership Council. He was out there when you and I were out there at Big 12 Media Day. He was talking about how he has to step up as a leader, but also just in the passing game as an option for ASU's eventual starting quarterback. There's also a lot of other guys in the mix in this room. You have AJ Ia going into his second season at ASU. He had a lot of hype last offseason trying to elevate his role this year, also bringing in Anthony Miller from Tulane, who could look to make a solid impact. You have Christian Ingman coming in from Portland State, James Giggy as a returner, and then also Hayden Berger and Landon Myrie, both coming in as true freshmen. But let's talk about Kamari Anderson first, Chris. He obviously did break that lower leg in ASU's final spring scrimmage, which kind of halted his trajectory a little bit this summer. But when you and I talked to him at Big 12 Media Days, he said he thinks he's going to be fine for the start of the season. He feels good about where his recovery is at. So with that in mind, what's kind of your expectations for Anderson this year? Because it's supposed to be a big year for him.
Yeah, so people, generally speaking, tend to put too much emphasis on tight ends catching the football and not enough emphasis on tight ends blocking. Okay. And I understand that's fantasy football. That is the productivity mindset, right?
Yeah.
And Kamari Anderson is a player who would be slept on and really kind of just generally underappreciated as a result of this fact, because he's one of the best returning blocking tight ends in the Big 12. He didn't get as many reps as Shimon Mateer or Cameron Harpel last year, but he outperformed both of those guys pretty clearly as a blocker. Okay. So, he, according to Pro Football Focus, he had a 72.6 run blocking grade and a 72.2 pass blocking grade. He was 5th in run blocking and tied for 14th in pass blocking in the Big 12 among all tight ends, right? So this is a player who, and he's now added 5 to 10 pounds. He's 255 pounds, but he moves extremely well. He's athletic. He really understands how to have a base, and that's athletic and powerful, and he strikes you. And that matters so much because remember, ASU, as we talked about in the first episode of the podcast and series, struggled at the point of attack, blocking in a way that hurt their run game production last season. In part, they didn't have enough potency in the backfield, but tight ends are going to be blocking 70, 80% of their snaps, okay? And Anderson is a very good blocker. I also believe that he can do most of the things that were accomplished by Shimon Mateer in the passing game. Maybe he's not quite that good, but I feel like he should be in line for a much bigger role this season. And he seems ready. The players all voted for him to be on this leadership council, which not super common for somebody who was the number 3 tight end on a team last year. But I think that he's going to probably play better than people would expect or realize maybe even better than they realize as the season's going on due to how good of a blocker that he actually is.
And Chris, one of the guys that Kamari Anderson just could not stop raving about at Big 12 Media Days was AJ Ia heading into his second year at ASU. He mentioned how AJ Ia, he believes, knows the playbook better than almost any of the other tight ends. He's been in the lab, he's been grinding. AJ Ia, when he came onto the scene as a true freshman last year, he was one of those guys that was getting all the clicks on social media. Wow, look how big this tight end is. He could be a huge weapon for ASU. What do you think is AJ Ia's ceiling in this offense? And do you think he could reach it this year? What's his role going to look like?
Well, his ceiling is quite high. He's certainly not going to reach it this year in his first year that he gets a lot of reps playing at the Power 4 level. Tight end also just generally tends to be a slower developing position. A lot of times I've felt like guys after 4 years or 5 years at ASU, when they got a professional opportunity, they still had quite a bit of room left to grow and develop. It's a complicated, difficult position. There's tons of alignments. You got to play with your hand down, attached. You're playing in the backfield, like an H-back sometimes, or a wing-back option. You got to be flexed out into the slot. You're going to be on the perimeter. You're playing from different stances, alignments, structures. You got to be able to catch the ball, run block, pass block. It's a lot. It's one of the more difficult and nuanced positions on the field. And Ia's not going to be anywhere near fully polished this year, but his talent level is quite high. 6'6", 265 pounds. That's big. That's bigger than most of the tight ends, almost all of them that we've seen in recent history. And he also is athletic in a three-point stance. He uncoils and he can run routes well. They threw the ball to him a fair amount in the spring. He had one really impressive block that helped secure one of the longer runs in the scrimmage. And I was impressed by Kamari Anderson saying that AJ Ia may know the playbook better than anyone else, just given that it's only his second year of college that he's going into, right? Compared to guys who are older and they've been doing it longer or been at ASU as long. In the case of Kamari Anderson, who also was at another school previously at Kentucky, right? So I do think we're going to see a significant role increase for AJ Ia. Probably not going to be the starter. We already talked about Kamari Anderson, but when you get into two tight end personnel groupings, which ASU will be in quite a bit, we call it 12 personnel or 22 personnel if you have two backs and two tight ends. ASU will probably be in there 15, 20, 25% of the time, depending on a variety of factors. That's where AJ Ia has more of an opportunity. And I think he's really, even more than competing with Kamari Anderson, he's probably competing more with this third player that we're going to talk about, Anthony Miller.
Yeah, like you said, let's get into Anthony Miller because he was a kind of sneaky under the radar addition in the portal for ASU that could look to make a bigger impact than the amount of headlines that were generated when ASU got him. Anthony Miller, a tight end addition from Tulane, another guy who's got a really big frame. He's a guy who could look to replace kind of that blocking production. You were talking about the blocking getting overlooked, that blocking production from a guy like Cameron Harpole who just departed. But also Miller has some upside in the passing game. He had a couple of moments in ASU's main event one-on-one period where he was turning heads a little bit and he was getting down into those routes. What do you feel like is going to be Miller's role this year?
Yeah, so at Tulane last year, which won the American Conference and played in the college football playoffs, very good football team. He was their third most utilized tight end, but he had a 300 or something plus snaps, so he was on the field quite a lot. 80% of those were from an attached alignment, playing with his hand in the dirt. So he really is a replacement for Cameron Harpole, who primarily serviced that role at ASU last year. But Miller is bigger, stronger, longer, 6'5", 265 pounds, but he has very long arms, like a basketball forward frame, probably 6'8", 6'9" type of a wingspan. And that length makes you play longer than you otherwise would, and that matters a lot for tight ends. His PFF grades last year weren't eye-poppingly good or anything like that, but from a pass pro standpoint, I would expect that he's going to be a pretty good player and a run blocker where Harpole was mediocre last year as evaluated by PFF. I think Miller's going to be more like an average or better than average Big 12 player who is only a junior. He's going to, evolve in this system and come to understand it more and work with Jason Mons and probably develop. And then by the time he's a senior, once Kamari Anderson, is out there, then, I think Miller's going to be able to take on an even larger role.
And Chris, as for ASU's other 4 tight ends, because as we know, typically in the past, ASU only really has 3 tight ends that kind of get that lion's share of the playing time. As for ASU's other tight ends, who are some guys that you think fans should kind of keep their eye on, not just for this season, but over the next few years as they potentially develop as Sun Devils, or some guys that maybe if an injury or two happens, you think they could be ready to step up right now?
Yeah, you touched on a really important point there, because tight ends, you often have some injuries. Kamari Anderson he said he's going to be like 100% at the beginning of camp. We'll see about that, right? But if somebody goes down, you're going to need another tight end to fill that third slot. And so you have a few options. James Giggy is the most sort of rugged, physical, compact blocker in the box option. He's heavier and has taken a lot of reps for ASU, and he's got sort of that physical mentality. He played D-line a lot in high school, so it's just sort of more natural, I think, for him. And then they added from Portland State, a transfer named Christian Ingman, who's more of the flex out space tight end that you would not probably use quite as much from an attached alignment, but he's somebody who, in the event that you do have injuries or whatever, can maybe help to plug some reps in some of your 12 personnel where somebody else is playing more like the Y tight end, I would say. And then ASU added 2 freshmen, Hayden Vircher and Landon Myrie. Myrie was in spring football. I was impressed by him for a freshman. I think he came in with a pretty good size and physicality element to him. He's not ready, I think, to play, or contend for a 2-deep role, but I think he's trending to where I think in the future he's got a chance to be able to do that. And then Vircher, he's athletic, he's leaner, more wiry build, and he's probably going to need to get bigger and stronger, but he's a very lanky, athletic player who maybe in a couple of years can be one of the better athletes that they have in the tight end group, maybe even the best athlete in the tight end group in a couple of years.
High praise right there. Definitely some guys for fans to keep their eyes on. And Chris, a group that fans definitely need to keep their eyes on, even if they aren't typically doing so, is the offensive line. We've got to talk about the offensive line. You mentioned how in this whole fantasy football driven world, the blocking kind of gets underrated, but ASU's offensive line is going to be one of those X factor position groups for what the ceiling or the floor could look like for this team this year. So let's break it into 3 parts. Let's talk about the tackles, the guards, and the centers. We'll start off with the centers. Center was not a strong point for ASU last year, to put it lightly. Coming off the 2024 Big 12 title campaign with Lee Fautanu, he departed, and ASU didn't really have an established answer at center. They tried to move Ben Coleman to center after having a successful year at guard. Then Coleman got hurt in that Utah game that you and I were both at, and that completely ended his season. Then it was kind of a revolving door with Wade Helton and Makua Pule, 2 younger guys getting reps. So ASU had to attack center in the transfer portal, especially with a point that we talked about in episode 1 of this series with the short yardage run game not being nearly good enough last year. So ASU goes out and gets one of the best centers in the portal in Tana Alu-Tupuola. He comes over from Georgia Tech. Georgia Tech was second in the ACC in both rushing yards and total yards last year. A big-time addition for Saga Tuitele in this offensive line. Do you feel like Tana Alu-Tupuola is already kind of locked in that starting role, or do you feel like some of these other guys have a chance?
I think he's a very strong leader. I would be shocked if he's not the starting center. Remember, a year ago, we spent so much time talking about how ASU was going to be able to move on after the loss of Lee Fautanu. Ben Coleman, great guard in the Big 12, struggled with his snapping last spring. It was a big talking point. The questions about that position just really continued into the early season. Then he got hurt, as you said. And ASU just wasn't nearly as good at that center position overall, which is so essential to your operation, right? Getting everybody lined up and communicating, the snap consistency, putting your quarterback in a position to be successful with the protections, working hip to hip with the guy next to them from a run blocking standpoint, having that physicality at the point of attack, and the mitigation of your penalties for snap infractions and other procedural type things. And I really felt like this spring, Allo Tupuola gave ASU a much more reliability in some of those areas. There were no major snap issues or procedural type things. That, for somebody who was just getting his feet wet in a new scheme, I think was pretty compelling overall, right? Is he going to be as good as Fautanu was in his first year at ASU, which is also, he's still quite young. Last year was his first year where he started several games, right? I don't think he's going to be quite there, but I do have a lot of confidence that position overall is going to be better with him in the fold. You touched on it there. Haynes King, dynamic weapon as a quarterback, but their run game overall was super compelling. And Georgia Tech was second in total yards, and Tana Alatupuola was not one of their highest graded offensive linemen, but he was pretty solid overall, all things considered. And those experiences are really only going to help him moving into this season at ASU.
Now, Chris, let's transition over to the tackle group. This is a group with a lot of turnover. Obviously, you have Maxi Honachor going in the first round to the Pittsburgh Steelers. That's a big guy you got to replace at right tackle. Then at left tackle, you have Josh Atkins getting an extra year of eligibility and transferring to the SEC, going to Missouri. Now you got to replace both of those guys in the same offseason. Jalen Clem and Champ Westbrooks both got the start for ASU in the Sun Bowl when both of those guys didn't participate in the bowl game. Looked pretty solid. Those guys are some contenders to get those starting spots this offseason, but there are some other guys who are going to be in the mix as well. You have Luke Baklenko coming over from Oklahoma. He was a backup at Oklahoma, but he did get some starting experience at Stanford. And then also Jermaine Mitchell. He was one of the huge talking points in the offseason a few months ago when ASU got him, because he was ASU's first ever #1 overall junior college acquisition. It was a big deal when the Sun Devils got him. He has a huge frame. He could be in the mix as well to start at one of the two tackle positions. Chris, how do you kind of see that competition for those starting roles playing out? Who are the guys that are kind of in the lead right now?
Yeah, this is really a major dogfight with 3 players fighting for 2 starting spots. And we already know that tackles and offensive linemen generally don't rotate as much as most of the other positions on the field. So if guys are playing well and they're healthy, they're going to get almost all of the snaps, right? You may rotate a little bit and see how a backup does early on in the season in non-conference or whatever. But what we're looking at here really is Jalen Clem and Champ Westbrooks, who both started and played reasonably well for ASU in the Sun Bowl against Duke. They're battling Luke Baklenko. As you said, Baklenko started early in his career at Stanford, like 2 seasons or a season and a half. He was a well-regarded transfer to Oklahoma. They thought he might start there. He ended up being their number 3 tackle. And then both of those starters returned this year. Baklenko wanted to start somewhere, decided to transfer to ASU. And he is a little bit more athletic than I had expected on a 300-pound frame at around 6'6". He was pretty impressive overall. And I think he has a good balance between his ability in run game, pass pro. I think he's probably a little bit further along from a pass protection standpoint. Extremely cerebral, smart player, as you would imagine, somebody who went to Stanford, right? So much so, in fact, that he, in his very first spring, was like coaching some of the younger players on technique and even some of the things schematically that ASU was trying to do, which really kind of caught my attention, that he's already kind of that far along to be able to do some of those things. But it's going to be difficult because Champ Westbrooks is one of the, in my opinion, better pro prospects in this group. He has worked really hard over the last couple of years to get bigger and stronger. That was his number 1 challenge, right? As he, was trying to learn and evolve and become a more skilled player. I think the biggest thing for him, though, was just getting a lot more size and strength kind of added to his frame, right? ASU had a extremely physical, impressive NFL first round caliber right tackle last year, who was the mentor for Champ Westbrooks in a lot of ways, which was really cool. Like Maxi Hanachor and Champ Westbrooks, they had this amazing banter between them in practices and in teaching skill, and you would see all the time Westbrooks take reps right after one of the best players in the Big 12. And so I think that really seeped into his understanding of the position, and he played well in the Sun Bowl. And I think he's now at this heavier, more physical weight. I think he's ready to be a fairly good starter in the Big 12. Full service player, very long arms, great frame, bends and moves very well. I think as he continues to add more strength and heft, he's going to be more of a body mover in the run game than he probably will be this season. But I don't think he's going to get beat much in pass protection, which is super important. That's a very glaring thing that you need to be able to do to win a starting job. And then Jalen Clem, like, you just can't say enough about a guy who has a stroke 2 years ago and then spends a year and a half recovering from that, like to the point where that affected to some degree his motor coordination in the immediate aftermath. And also he lost 40 to 50 pounds, which was already his biggest challenge to being able to become a starter, because he was one of the lighter players in the group and didn't have as much physical heft to him. His dad, Adrian Clem, who was a O-line coach at Oregon, the Pittsburgh Steelers, at UCLA, back when ASU was in the Pac-12. So he had this advanced understanding and feel for the position at an early age, especially in his footwork and his movement skills as a pass protector. But he couldn't as well demonstrate that advanced feel for the game in the physicality of the run game because he was lighter and not as able to use strength as a important signature thing. Now he's finally at around 300 pounds, which is the heaviest he told me that he's been. And I think that added heft, as long as it doesn't detract at all from his mobility, which we're going to find out a little bit in camp, I think that's going to make him a better run blocker, where he was a below average probably last year or in the past. But his ability to mirror speed on the edge and keep guys in front of him in pass pro, I expect to be very good, probably even better than Josh Atkins. They just may not have as good of a run blocker as Josh Atkins was last year at left tackle if it ends up being Clem. But I like where this trio is at overall, and I was reasonably impressed by them in spring ball.
So, Chris, I want to go back to that point you made where you said it is 3 guys battling for 2 spots, because I think a lot of fans and board members are probably thinking, why isn't Jermaine Mitchell in the mix? We thought it was 4 guys battling for 2 spots. Why do you feel strongly that he's not exactly on the same level as those other 3? Is there anything he can do to get there? And if he's kind of in that more backup 2 deep developmental mix, who are some other guys that are kind of in that backup 2 deep developmental pool that you think fans should keep their eye on?
Yeah, so the great news about Jermaine Mitchell is that he is huge and he moves very well for his size. When I watched his junior college film, terrific range as a run blocker, and he just smothered and covered everybody from a pass pro standpoint. But the jump is pretty significant from junior college to the Power 4 level. And that requires much better understanding and feel for the game. And the problem was he had a nagging injury leading up to spring ball that prevented him from being a full participant for the first few weeks of spring football. So that put him a little bit behind the developmental arc that you would prefer for a junior college player that you expected to compete for a starting job in preseason camp. Doesn't mean he can't rapidly accelerate to where he then becomes an option to battle those other guys. But more likely, I think he's somebody who works his way into that sort of a readiness and then gets a lot better and then explodes into next season when Jalen Clem will depart. And Luke Baklenko is also a senior. So it's savvy for ASU to get Jermaine Mitchell without needing him to be pressed into an immediate starting role and allowing him to develop in a way that makes sense for everybody in the equation, right? And then ASU also added Siosaya Lapuaho, Lenny Lapuaho, junior college player who can play tackle or guard. I think he's not as lanky, tall, rangy, but he's got very good quick twitch for an offensive lineman tackle. He can really get out and run. He functions quite well in a lot of the outside zone, stretch zone type of things that you want to do in the run game, and he has the mobility to be a pass pro in a pretty impressive way. I think that he was better than I maybe expected. Not ready maybe to start, but he's in the conversation legitimately. They also have Xander Rugaroli, who was a redshirt freshman last season, and he went through some growing pains, but felt like he got a lot better. He is an option to play tackle or guard. So they have some guys that I think are very intriguing, who are behind their top trio. And so overall, you would say that this is a position group that appears to be in very good shape based on what Sanga Tuitele has been able to build over the last few years.
All right, Chris, let's transition over to that last part of the offensive line. Let's talk about ASU's guards. The first guy who immediately comes to mind, at least should come to mind for all fans, is Mekhi Stewart. He was one of the best young players on ASU's roster last year, started games as a true freshman. You've raved on the board about his potential upside in this offense. You also have Wade Helton, who got some guard reps on top of getting those center reps that we talked about a little bit earlier in the episode. He is a guy who could be in the mix for a starting spot. Rob Lapuaho, who redshirted last year, he showed a lot of upside in practices. He could be in the mix as well. And then Terrell Kim, he's a solid young player who's had a tough time battling some injuries. He also could be in the mix too. It seems like those are kind of the four guys who could be battling for those two starting spots, with it feeling like Mekhi Stewart probably already has a little bit of a death grip on one of them. So three guys battling for that last one. Is that kind of a correct assessment? Where do you feel like the group is at?
Yeah, there's no doubt that Mekhi Stewart is not getting talked about anywhere near as much as he should be by ASU fans and just in general. I'm not a big EA Sports, college football guy, but this was after I wrote my evaluation of Mekhi Stewart.
Mm-hmm.
I checked out their the scores that they give, the grades that they give,
the overalls for each player.
Yeah, well, I was looking at that, but also the strength component. And what I saw was that Mekhi Stewart had a 91 strength, which is the highest on the team. In fact, it was higher than CJ Fight's 89. And people know CJ Fight, who we'll talk about in a bit, with the D tackles. He's one of the stronger, more physical presence that they have on the team, right? So Mekhi Stewart really, really impressed me last year to the point where I'm like, this is the freshman who has the best chance to maybe make an impact, despite the fact that it's an offensive line where that's very unlikely. He has exceedingly rare strength and power for a now sophomore, but last year as a freshman, offensive guard. He's a mauler. Like, I don't use that term almost ever to describe ASU's interior lineman. Probably a little bit too big. Like, he should be a 335 pounder versus a 350 pounder, but he still moves reasonably well. And he is the guy who can dislodge and move bodies better than anybody that they have in this group. I'm very confident that he's going to be a starter and a much more talked about player over the next year or two. He has absolutely NFL draft upside as a guard. So I have to imagine he's going to be a starter. And then there are other candidates would be Wade Helton, Rob Lapuaho, and Terrell Kim. Those are the most likely candidates. I already said that Lenny Lapuaho, who's a cousin, like a distant cousin, I think, of Rob Lapuaho, he maybe also could slide inside. But another guy who's being slept on is Rob Lapuaho, who didn't play last year as a redshirt freshman, but he's very big, 6'5", 6'6", 330, 340, and he's got power and movement skills, and increasingly making very good strides with his feel for the game and his understanding what they're trying to do schematically, to where like you better be careful because he's got more upside than others in the group who have more experience, right? Wade Helton, we didn't talk about him that much in the center conversation, even though he's probably the second most likely center. It's like, I would say it's reasonably close at center between Wade Helton and Makua Pule, right? But Wade Helton, I think, would be as likely as anyone else to start at guard other than Makai Stewart. And that is because he had the experience last year. He played center and guard. He comes from a great high school developmental program at Corona Centennial, super cerebral, well-coached, highly skilled, very little deficiencies in his game. 6'5", maybe 6'4", 6'5", 310 pounds or so. I just feel like he does everything reasonably well. Nothing maybe outstanding, but he's like a very good, solid, reliable option. Rob Lapuaho probably has more upside, but is he as ready to be able to play? That's part of the conversation, right? And then Terrell Kim, I liked him a lot coming into ASU from high school, and he did an amazing job of going from 380 pounds to 330 pounds in the span of a year. And at 330, he looks fantastic. Problem is that he's been in a walking boot as much as he's been in a regular cleat for the last year and a half that he's been at ASU. And that continued on into spring football. They were very cautious with him, and he should be back to full participation at the outset of camp. And he has some road grading type upside as a run blocker. So I'm interested in seeing, how he's able to do coming off of this prolonged period of injury.
And Chris, to put a button on the offensive line group, what are your overall expectations for the unit as a whole compared to previous seasons in recent ASU history? And who are some just niche developmental guys that you think fans should kind of be looking at?
Yeah. So look, there's not going to be anybody get drafted in the first round next year. Like ASU lost one of the better offensive tackles in the country. And I still think, though, that the overall group may be as good or potentially even better last year when you really consider the importance of the center position and experience and reps and that reliable operation that you're trying to attain. And also the more run game potency that I think they might be able to have with Makai Stewart's evolution, Wade Helton being a year older, what Tana Alatupuola does at center, right? I have questions about their tackle run blocking potency compared to last year, where I think that was maybe more of a strength than we'll see this year. But like this group, they may need to do more screen game and more kind of movement stuff. Like this is more of a stretch zone, outside zone. The linemen can really run and move quite well, whereas that wasn't as much the case with Josh Atkins or maybe not even Maxi Hanachor. So I think it's going to be a little bit different of a group, but I expect the pass pro to be good, if not very good.
Okay.
If these guys play to their capability and they function cohesively. And I think the run game should still be good, especially with what they have on the interior. I think their interior run blocking may be better than it was last year.
All right. Well, we'll get right into breaking down the last portion of this part 2 episode right after a quick word from our podcast presenting sponsors over at Jones Auto Centers.
For over 60 years, the Glenn Jones name has been recognized for integrity and honesty.
And the Jones Auto Centers in Wickenburg.
Jones Ford Verde Valley.
Take a nice country drive out to Buckeye.
When you're talking about Arizona's best, you're talking about the Jones Auto Group. It's quick, fast, strong.
I want to invite you to visit our new facility in Casa Grande and enjoy our country-style way of doing business. We're the Joneses.
Welcome back into the Sun Devil Source podcast presented by our friends over at Jones Auto Centers. Wherever you're watching or listening to this podcast, be sure to check out the description portion below because you can contact Parker Jones directly through phone or email if you're interested in buying a new or used vehicle from one of Jones Auto Centers' many dealerships around the valley. Parker Jones and Jones Ford Verde Valley have been huge supporters of ASU's NIL efforts over the past few years, so we're proud to have them as our podcast presenting sponsors. That's another great reason for you Sun Devil fans to make them your go-to if you live in the valley and need a new or used vehicle. All right, Chris, last part of this part 2 episode, let's break down ASU's defensive line. A lot to talk about with this position group, and there was a big headline that you broke just about a month or two ago with a season-ending Achilles injury for defensive tackle Michael Gardner. We've talked about it at large. Very unfortunate for him, given the trajectory he was on coming off of tearing his other Achilles last year and that making him sit out all of last season. And that injury kind of narrowed down ASU's defensive tackle group into being a clear top 3 with CJ Fight. He was one of the only guys on ASU's team to make a preseason all-conference team. Everyone knows him. He's one of the biggest leaders and faces of the program. But then also Zach Swanson and Blazin Lono Wong, guys who have a fair amount of experience at ASU. Swanson had a foot injury last spring that pretty much derailed his 2025 season, which led to a lot more reps for Blazin Lono Wong. So those guys both have a fair amount of experience. How would you say the top end of that defensive line group is looking right now?
Yeah, that Gardner injury was a hit for sure. He had a very good second half to his spring ball, looked better than I had expected coming off the Achilles injury that he suffered on the other leg last offseason. But this is still a good group. It's still better than a typical ASU team on average. And, of course, it starts with CJ Fight. Brian Ward, ASU's defensive coordinator, has called Fight the cornerstone of what they do defensively. People know nose tackles don't get like a lot of the tackles and the flash plays. And so they get underappreciated just generally. But it's important that people understand CJ Fight is one of the best players at one of the most important positions on any defense. He's anchored ASU's run stopping ability, which is top 3 in the Big 12 in each of the last 2 seasons. And he's going to be really good. I'd like to see him become even more powerful and knock guys around even a little bit more than he did a year ago, and also potentially show a little bit more burst and leverage playing his way into the backfield to where he can be around the quarterback or the running back for more TFL and sack opportunities. I think that he's optimized his body now better than in his earlier years, and he has a developed feel for the game to where you understand situations and you have that thing that basically just cues the opportunities for you that you then are able to take advantage of that maybe you weren't able to do earlier in your career. Zach Swanson, he was arguably the most dynamic defensive tackle that they had in 2024. It was either Swanson or Jeffrey Clark. So he was a very important player. He contrasts very nicely with CJ Fight, not as stout, not as strong, physical, but he's rangier. He has the ability to make more range plays and be more of a disruptor, working his way into the backfield. And then Blazin Lono Wong is a sort of in between those two guys. He's a very good complement who can play as a backup nose tackle behind CJ Fight. He can play physically against the run at the other D tackle position. He could play behind Zach Swanson. Those guys are going to suck up most of the reps. I think that Gardner had been in position to be the most dynamic athlete that they had in the group. Now it's probably Zach Swanson, as long as he's healthy. As you said, last year was really rough on him, but they were cautious with him in the spring, and I feel like he's going to be ready to go 100% at the outset of preseason camp. And I think that overall, this is a very good, not great, but very good trio at the top of ASU's D tackles to anchor what they're trying to do defensively.
And Chris, below that trio, you have a lot of guys who are going to be competing for that fourth spot in the 2 deep. You have Rashad McKenzie, Hiram Vayono, Jeffrey Manns, and Ramar Williams, who kind of might play a little bit of that Justin Watley hybrid role that fans are used to seeing between defensive end and defensive tackle. To get that fourth spot, who do you feel like are the favorites, and who are maybe some guys who are kind of in the backseat and looking at more of a developmental track over the next few years?
Yeah, I think it's super open between 3 or 4 players, depending upon how coaches want to utilize Ramar Williams. Last year, he was their 4th or 5th D tackle as a redshirt freshman, young player, graded poorly by PFF, but just kind of getting up to speed at this level. He had a shoulder injury that he was battling. He ended up having surgery, and they were talking about playing him at DN because it's a less physically demanding position, and they lost Justin Watley, and who's a bigger DN, and Ramar Williams can maybe service that type of a role against the more pro style teams and going up against the heavier personnel groupings, 12 personnel. Now that Gardner's hurt, I'm curious to see if they're going to continue with that approach, or maybe they move Ramar Williams back to where he's more of a base down option at D tackle, right? Rashad McKenzie, very intriguing, came in from Washington State last year as a transfer. He had injuries and he just wasn't really able to practice regularly. This spring, though, he used his length very effectively. He's 6'5" and around 300 pounds, bends and coils better than a lot of guys who struggle by being too upright as D tackles. He's able to still get leverage, and his length causes problems because of how he can get his arms and hands into spots that other guys maybe aren't able to do. So I think that presents some challenges for interior offensive linemen. And then ASU added 2 junior college defensive tackles, which I thought might have been overkill at the time that happened. But then after Gardner's injury, I was like, oh, wait a second, that was actually pretty smart. So these coaches know what they're doing. Hiram Vayono maybe a little bit more ready between the two of Jeffrey Manns and Vayono, but it's reasonably close, and they both look better than I had expected in spring ball. Like a lot of times, as I said earlier, junior college players come in, they have to learn how to get their stance, and they're trying to figure out the scheme and their role and play concept. These guys are a little bit savvier and more ready than I had expected, and they're reasonably good athletes for defensive tackles. And so either one of them could potentially end up winning a 4th or a shared 4th role, right? Where maybe they're playing 100 or 200 snaps or something along those lines.
And Chris, now let's talk about edge, our last little group of this video. ASU lost 3 of its top 4 defensive ends from last season, and almost lost 4 of its top 4 defensive ends from last season until in the final hour, Clayton Smith was granted that extra year of eligibility. So ASU hit the portal hard, not knowing if they'd even have Smith. They get Jalen Thompson from Michigan State and Marion Winston from Baylor. Those are probably going to be the 3 starting caliber defensive ends between Smith, Thompson, and Winston. What do those guys bring?
Yeah, they're all going to play starter number of reps. So D end and defensive line in general, in contrast to what we said earlier about the offensive line, where you don't really have guys rotating, D line is where you have the most rotation, usually on your team. And so they have 3 absolute bona fide, better than average, or even very good, bordering on great defensive ends. I am extremely impressed by what I saw from the two newcomers in spring ball, especially Jalen Thompson. I felt like Thompson looked like one of the best players on ASU's defense, if not its entire team in spring ball. He has a physicality, which coming from the Big Ten and Michigan State, you might kind of expect that in a fifth-year senior. I think he's a fifth-year guy who weighs 260 pounds. He plays the run with power. Like, he dislodges the guys in front of him. He can knock guys back. He has the ability to carry out onto the perimeter, flatten out, and prevent things from opening up along the line of scrimmage. He also is a reasonably good pass rusher for the type of player that he is as a 260 pounder. Not going to be a high volume sack guy. None of these guys really are. ASU isn't that type of a team, and it hasn't been the last couple of years. They want to be able to control the line of scrimmage by having guys win at the point of attack. Okay, one gapping, winning at the point of attack, disrupts run game, gets guys playing into the backfield. It's not like a pin your ears back and turn loose and be reckless and have gaps that then get exposed in the screen game or run game. They're not that. But I'm telling you right now, Jalen Thompson, really good, so much so that maybe he's even a guy who could be drafted in another year. Wow. Imarion Winston is, I would say that he's like maybe at least as good as a Prince Dorba, a little bit heavier body type. So Prince Dorba was a solid mid-tier starting caliber Big 12 defensive end last year. Winston is very long-limbed. His length is problematic. He probably plays the run a little bit better slightly better maybe than their average DN did last year. And yet he still has the ability to play into the backfield. These guys are just going to be very good containers of the run, and they're not going to get moved, and lanes are not going to really open on them. They're not going to get a bunch of sacks. Maybe they get several sacks or something like that, 4 or 5 sacks. That might be like an average amount that you might expect from these types of guys. Clayton Smith, he's continue to get bigger and stronger and play the run a lot better to fit what ASU wants to defensively. They tinkered with him as a wide receiver in spring ball, and maybe situationally he could be like a jump ball target in the red zone or something like that. But most of his reps are going to come at defensive end, and you can expect he's going to be at least as good as he was last year, maybe even better as he's continued to get bigger and stronger and understand the DNA of what they're trying to do defensively. So those are clearly their top 3 defensive ends, and then there's some candidates behind them that are trying to fight for additional roles.
Yeah, let's talk about those candidates right now, Chris. There's that key 4th spot in that base down 2 deep that ASU is kind of looking to fill. There are 2 guys who feel like they're kind of a little bit ahead of the rest in competing for that spot. You have Roman Petrie. He's a senior. He's kind of been building towards that role. And then also Julian Hugo, the 4-star freshman coming in from Texas, who just completely lit the practice fields ablaze once he came in. You've talked about it. I'm sure you're going to do so right now, how he's one of those NFL draft upside guys out of that true freshman class that came in for ASU. There are also some other base down backup options. You can maybe slot Ramar Williams in there, Kurt Vakalaki, a junior college guy who came out of Australia, and then also Celesi Manu. How do you feel like the competition for that 4th spot is going to go down?
I'm reasonably confident that this is going to come down to Roman Petrie and Julian Hugo. It's very interesting. Petrie, similar to Elijah O'Neal, a solid, well-built, big base down end who developed over a few-year period at ASU and is now sort of ready to be a role player in a rotation at defensive end. Not going to get a bunch of sacks, but his length he's able to utilize effectively, and he's stronger and better able to play the run. And Julian Hugo, wow, most of the things that we've said about him have been behind our paywall, like premium podcast stuff and hot 11 type stuff. This is really, I think, the first thing that a lot of more casual, no offense to ASU fans, but a little more casual ASU fans are like, okay, tell me about the team, like going into spring ball, right? Julian Hugo is potentially the best freshman defensive end that I have seen in my time covering ASU, which is going back to like 20 or so years. So you might have to go back to like a Terrell Suggs, which is like, the Mount Rushmore, right, of ASU.
Yeah.
You might have to go back to Terrell Suggs to find somebody who looked like they had more potential. And Terrell Suggs was super special. I'm not saying Julian Hugo is as good as Terrell Suggs. But what I'm saying is there hasn't been a guy since Terrell Suggs who, as a freshman at ASU, really jumped to my mind as a special talent. He is big, strong, physical, fast, smart, explosive. He uses his hands far better than the typical freshman. He has a natural instinct. Like this guy in spring ball, nobody would have thought this was a freshman if you just saw him practicing. No way. He looked like he was one of their upperclassmen guys who's been doing this at this level for a couple of years. So to my eye, he's going to be really hard to keep off the field. Is he as good right now in every way as a Roman Petrie? Probably not. But is he close enough with all of this other athletic offering that he puts out there? Is going to be hard to keep off the field? I would say so. And he has the ability to play inside on third downs because of his instincts and his physicality as a pass rusher. ASU fans are he was their highest rated defensive high school edition in the 2026 class. Texas came in and tried to steal him late, and he decided to not go to Texas and instead play at ASU. And I think he's the freshman who's going to have the biggest impact on the entire team.
Lots of high praise from you there. And now quickly to wrap up the D-line, let's talk about two cheetah package guys who could end up having some I'm mixing up my words 53 minutes in, some pass rushing burn for the Sun Devils this season. Albert Smith and Joshua Shanklin. Smith was kind of building up into that role a little bit last year, and Joshua Shanklin, a guy who came in from JUCO last year. What do you have on what the impact those two guys could bring?
Last season was frankly disappointing for Albert Smith. I had written a lot about how impressed that I was in the run up and practices in camp and in spring ball. Coaches had spoken very highly about him. Explosive get off. He is the best edge bender that they probably have at their disposal. Not a bigger guy, not going to be a base down guy. He's 230 pounds at the most. 225 maybe, 6'1", very long arms. He's like a sports car cornering around the edge. Mm-hmm. But he came into the game in some sub-package opportunities last year, and he got penalized, hands to the face, too much grabbing and holding, and it felt like maybe he put too much pressure on himself, or the moment was a little bit too big for him when he got his opportunities, and he didn't take advantage of them. He has to play more within himself and allow his natural ability to kind of shine through within the construct of what they're trying to do defensively. And if he does that, then I think he should play a lot this year as a third down pass rusher, because as good as the other players are, nobody is as quick twitch explosive. And that's what you want to have as one of your defensive ends in that cheetah package when you're third down and you know the other team's going to throw the ball 90% of the time, right? And then I think ASU's coaches did a very smart thing in adding Joshua Shanklin. He had like 14 sacks or something like that as a true freshman junior college player in California, all-state junior college player. He was a qualifier out of high school, just didn't really get recruited, went JUCO. He played as a stand-up outside edge player, like in a more of a 3-4 type of a defense. So he had to learn how to play with his hand down and have the right setup, base, footwork to really be able to play the position from a three-point stance. He made very good strides last year throughout the season, and developmentally, I think was one of the players who progressed as much as anyone. And he was able to use it as a redshirt year, so he still has 3 more years available to him. And now he is competing with Albert Smith for that cheetah package third down role. And they could potentially even use both of them in some instances if they're both up to the task. I don't think that they will, but that's can't be ruled out at a minimum. So if one or both of those guys are able to play to the capability that I anticipate, I think that's going to make ASU more dynamic and force the quarterback to get the ball out of his hands more quickly than he would like to, prevent route development. Third down, you got to wait for guys to get to where they're trying to be on the field with their routes to throw the football to him, and you can kind of take away some of that stuff if these guys do their jobs.
And Chris, to kind of put a button on everything we talked about in this episode, the trenches were a huge strength for the Sun Devils when they won the Big 12 conference title back in 2024. As a collective offensive line, defensive line, blocking tight ends unit, when you look at this roster, how does it stack up?
It looks pretty good. I think that their defensive line depth and talent is at least as good as last year, potentially even better. I would have certainly said better had they had Michael Gardner. So I'm interested in seeing how some of these other guys, Vayono and Jeffrey Manns and McKenzie, do in camp. And they have to stay healthy, of course. But I think that the iron sharpens iron sort of, phrase that we use in discussing football, I think that is something that can be very encouraging about this particular team. Remember, Kenny Dillingham talked last year about being disappointed that he didn't have a more physically demanding spring ball and preseason camp to get the guys ready for the season in the way that they did the prior year with Utah and what Kyle Whittingham had accomplished over a long period, being like the North Star, right? The most physical team at the line of scrimmage. I feel like ASU is trying to get back to that, and these players have the ability to do well with that. Offensive tackle, I want to see the run game capability there. Everywhere else, I really do like what they should be able to do. Establishing the run, defending the run, being able to fit in conceptually with what ASU's identity aspires to be under Kenny Dillingham.
All right, well, that'll do it for part 2 of our 4-part ASU fall camp preview. Talked about the O-line, D-line, and tight ends. Next episode, we're going to be talking about the linebackers and the secondary. Chris and I have been absolutely grinding to put these episodes out for you guys. So make sure to like, subscribe, all the things, no matter where you're watching to this podcast. And we hope you all have a great rest of your day.